This is a presentation for you Old Testament lovers, Hittites, about the people, the civilization, and what we know about them. The Hittites are mentioned about 50 times in the Old Testament, so that's quite frequent, and they are in 15 of the 39 Old Testament books, but outside of the Bible they are not mentioned a single time in our antique records. So many critics, they said that they are just imagination or fiction. But are they? Did they really exist, the Hittites? Yes, they did. About 100 years ago, they found about 10,000 clay tablets in Turkey. It's written with the Akkadian language, the diplomatic language of that time. They have found all these clay tablets and statues and gates and temples and a palace and so on. So they did really exist, and they were a great nation that was expanding. So they were competing with Egypt and Assyria on equal terms. So it's a great civilization. The Hittite people, they entered Anatolia around 2300 BC, probably. We don't know if they came from the north or east or west, but some say from the north. They were an Indo-European people like the Greeks, so they were not Semite people like the Israelites, so they have a different language tradition. They also occupied or lived in Canaan. We can read in the Bible in Genesis 23, for instance, at the time of Abraham, that's 2000 BC, they lived there, and 1,000 years later, at the time of David, there were still Hittites in Canaan. Now their capital was called Hadassah, and it's a bit east of Ankara in Turkey. So on the picture you see the upper part of the city. It was a quite large city with about 50,000 people in it. They had thick walls, and some towers were up to 30 meters high, so that's quite high. There was a royal palace, it was quite large, and a temple area with about 200 halls and rooms. So it was a big city. Here we can see the Lion Gate. There are many gates to the city. There was also a library. Now they have found even more tablets. They have about 30,000 cuneiform tablets, and they were archived and classified in perfect order. So this is like 4,000 years ago. And the language was totally unknown, though they know it's an Indo-European language. So now they have interpreted it, so they can read all these tablets now. You can even go to a university to learn the language. So we know that they really existed, and they were quite advanced. There has been found letters and laws, we'll talk more about that later, military instructions, religious texts, and so on. During the same period, we have Egypt being a huge civilization, and we can read letters from about 1350 BC, clay tablets, also cuneiform. I'll talk more about them in another presentation. They tell about decline of the Egyptian influence in the Middle Eastern region. And it also mentions the Hebrews, for the first time in writing. So the Egyptians tried to expand, and they had some problems. Now the Hittites up in the north, coming down from Turkey, they did expand down into Syria, into Judah, and tried to come further down into Egypt. And there was a huge battle. You can see it says Kadesh on the map between the red and the green area. Ramses II is the pharaoh of Egypt at that time. In 1275 BC, he had a large fight with a Hittite king. It became the largest chariot battle ever. There were more than 5,000 chariots. Here on an Egyptian relief, you can see the Hittite chariot. The Hittites, they had 3 people in the chariot, so that was a great advantage. So on the left, you can see the Egyptian pharaoh holding the prisoners, the Hittites, in his hand. So that's the record according to Ramses. But the Egyptians actually had to give some areas to the Hittites, so I don't think they were that victorious. A few years later, they signed a peace treaty between the Egyptians and the Hittites. So that's the picture on the right. You have the peace treaty. The Hittites had a quite advanced legal system, a bit like the one we find in the Bible. It was a bit more merciful than the Babylonians, so they didn't have the death penalty for petty crimes like the Babylonians had. Even if you killed someone, you didn't always get the death penalty. You could pay a fee instead. And for the first time in human history, we also see both human rights and women's social rights in the Hittite legal system. We won't talk about more laws, but they had a very complex setup, and people have criticized the Bible and said that the laws of Moses, they couldn't be from that period. But now we can see that there were quite advanced laws in the Middle East at that time. This civilization, the Hittites, was built on duty and on discipline and on sacrifice. So people were supposed to follow what the king said, and there was quite harsh discipline. They also enjoyed music like most other people, and we can see pictures of some people playing different kind of instruments. Religion was a big part of the Hittite culture, but they did adopt many of the other gods from civilizations around them. In the southeast of their empire, they had the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians, and they imported a lot of their gods. And something that was unique to the Hittites is that they accepted those gods as legitimate gods. Last slide, the downfall of the Hittites. We don't know for sure what happened, but there was a lot of civil war at the end, and there were claims to the throne, and all of these struggles within. But then came also some struggles from outside, some sea people. They weakened the Hittites, and we can read about the sea people in other literature, also from the Egyptians, and we know from Canaan. They had troubles with the sea people also at that period. And about 1160 BC, the empire collapsed. So there were small kingdoms, Neo-Hittite post-empire states that lingered on for some 100 years, but that was more or less the end of this empire. So if you want to, there's a small, shorter part too. Bye.